11 Golden Age stars who beat their wives. They were Hollywood's leading men, handsome, charming, and adored by millions. On screen, they wooed the most beautiful women in the world with tender words and gentle touches. The cameras captured their romantic sides, and America fell in love. But when the lights went down and the cameras stopped rolling, a different story unfolded behind closed doors. The same men who played heroes and lovers on screen terrorized the women who had the misfortune of marrying them. Hollywood's golden age had a dirty secret. The stars who taught America how to love were teaching their wives about fear. Their mansions weren't just homes, they were private battlegrounds where fame and power created perfect cover for abuse that the studio system worked tirelessly to conceal. The studios didn't just hide affairs and drinking problems, explains former Publicity Department Secretary Margaret Wilson. They actively covered up domestic violence. Police would be paid off, doctors would be silenced, and publicists would craft stories about accidents when wives showed up with bruises or broken bones. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 11 of Hollywood's most beloved male stars who lived double lives, charming the public while terrorizing their wives. These aren't just stories of bad marriages or occasional arguments, they're accounts of systematic abuse protected by a powerful industry that valued box office numbers over women's safety. The truth behind these Hollywood marriages reveals not just individual cruelty, but an entire system built to protect abusers while silencing victims. In an era before Me Too, before social media, and before domestic violence was widely understood, these women suffered in silence while the men who hurt them continued being celebrated as icons of American manhood. Get ready for the Hollywood history they never wanted you to know.
A lot of good things. I was just drifting around, and I had a ready ear, and I was able to...
The wholesome crooner, Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was America's beloved crooner, the smooth-voiced star whose Christmas specials and road movies with Bob Hope created an image of wholesome, paternal warmth. With his pipe, cardigan sweaters, and easy smile, Crosby represented the ideal American dad that post-war audiences wanted to believe in. Behind that carefully crafted image lurked a man with a terrifying temper and a willingness to use his fists on those weaker than himself, including his wife and children. Crosby's son Gary wrote in his shocking 1983 memoir that Bing physically and emotionally abused him and his brothers, notes family violence historian Dr. Rebecca Stevens. The book Going My Own Way painted a disturbing portrait of life inside the Crosby household, one completely at odds with Bing's public persona as the ultimate good-natured family man. While Gary's memoir focused primarily on the brutal treatment he and his brothers received, it also revealed disturbing insights into Crosby's relationship with his first wife, Dixie Lee. Gary described his mother Dixie as living in fear, Stevens continues. While he didn't document specific instances of physical abuse toward her, he portrayed a household where everyone walked on eggshells around Bing's unpredictable temper. Dixie was depicted as someone who couldn't protect her children from their father's violence because she herself was intimidated by him. According to Gary's account, Bing's disciplinary methods went far beyond normal correction into the territory of sadistic abuse. He didn't just spank his children, he beat them with instruments designed to cause maximum pain while minimizing visible marks. He beat us with belts, paddles, and his fists. And our mother couldn't stop him, Gary wrote. The boys were weighed weekly, and if they had gained weight, they received beatings with a special whipping strap Crosby called the switch. Gary claimed his father even fitted the handle with steel pellets to increase the pain. When Gary's book appeared, Hollywood insiders weren't entirely surprised. Stories had circulated for years about Crosby's controlling behavior and explosive temper, but the studio system had successfully maintained his public image as the gentle, wise patriarch. Paramount Pictures had too much invested in Crosby's wholesome persona to allow rumors of domestic violence to tarnish their valuable property. Dixie Lee, who died of ovarian cancer in 1952, never publicly spoke about her marriage. Like many women of her generation, she maintained silence about domestic problems, particularly given the enormous public adoration for her husband and the studio's interest in protecting his image. After Gary's book was published, a family division emerged. Two of Gary's brothers, Philip and Dennis, supported his account, confirming that their father had indeed been physically abusive throughout their childhood. The fourth brother, Lindsay, didn't directly confirm the abuse allegations, but struggled throughout his life with depression and alcohol abuse, eventually dying by suicide in 1989. Dennis would also later die by suicide. These tragic outcomes lend credibility to claims that the Crosby household was a deeply traumatic environment, one where Dixie Lee was either unable or unwilling to intervene to protect her children, suggesting her own position of vulnerability within the family dynamic. Crosby's second family, with actress Kathryn Grant and their 3 children, reported a much different home environment, suggesting that Crosby may have modified his behavior in his later years. However, this doesn't erase or excuse the terror he inflicted in his first household. The image: America's beloved father figure singing White Christmas. The reality: a man who terrorized his family while his wife watched helplessly. The contrast between Crosby's public persona and private behavior represents one of Hollywood's most successful image management campaigns, and one of its most disturbing deceptions.
Oh, now look, girlie. Do me a favor. Don't be hard to handle, will you? Remember, it's going to be hard enough, even if you're easy.
The tortured genius, Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy projected strength and moral authority on screen. His powerful performances as priests, judges, and principled everymen earned him 9 Academy Award nominations and 2 wins. Critics praised his natural acting style and the effortless integrity he brought to his characters. Off-screen, a very different Spencer Tracy emerged after the drinking started, a man whose alcohol-fueled rage terrified the women in his life. Tracy was a known alcoholic with an explosive temper, explains film historian Michael Barnes. His drinking problems were an open secret in Hollywood, but the full extent of his volatile behavior was carefully concealed by MGM's powerful publicity department, which worked overtime to maintain his image as one of America's most respected actors. Tracy remained married to his wife Louise for 43 years, though they separated early in his Hollywood career. While he never officially divorced her, primarily due to his strict Catholic beliefs, he maintained a 26-year relationship with actress Katharine Hepburn that became one of Hollywood's most celebrated, though technically adulterous, love stories. Hepburn described Tracy as physically intimidating and emotionally abusive when drinking, Barnes continues. She spoke privately to friends about walking on eggshells during his binges, afraid of triggering his unpredictable anger. While publicly maintaining the narrative of their great love affair, Hepburn's private accounts reveal a much more troubled relationship marked by Tracy's alcoholism and verbal cruelty. During his drinking episodes, Tracy would undergo a complete personality transformation. The thoughtful, intelligent man would disappear, replaced by someone capable of vicious verbal attacks and physically threatening behavior. While Hepburn never publicly claimed Tracy physically assaulted her, she described situations where she feared violence might erupt. Louise Tracy, who remained legally his wife until his death in 1967, experienced the worst of Tracy's behavior during their early years together. Friends reported that Tracy's alcoholism and violent outbursts were factors in their separation, though Louise maintained public silence about the specific reasons for their estrangement. He drank to disappear and turned violent when he came back. This pattern defined Tracy's relationships. When sober, he could be charming, intellectually engaging, and even tender. But alcohol unleashed a darker personality characterized by towering rages, cruel insults, and intimidating behavior that left both Louise and later Hepburn in positions of managing his volatility rather than being treated as equal partners. The studio system worked diligently to conceal Tracy's alcoholism and abusive behavior. MGM had substantial financial investment in his image as one of Hollywood's most prestigious actors, and stories of domestic discord would have contradicted the dignified moral authority he projected on screen. Police were instructed to handle any incidents involving Tracy with extreme discretion, and the press maintained a code of silence about his private problems. Tracy's story illustrates how completely Hollywood could separate public image from private reality, creating a beloved screen presence from a man whose actual behavior caused significant suffering to those closest to him. His acting legacy remains extraordinary, but the human cost of his untreated alcoholism and abusive tendencies represents the dark shadow behind his professional achievements. The image, the dignified, principled everyman of American cinema. The reality, an alcoholic whose drinking unleashed a monster that terrified the women who loved him.
I had to constantly feed them. I had a bucket of fish by my side in the sea, talking to this seal and feeding it between the shots.
The deadly charmer, Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison epitomized sophisticated charm on screen, whether playing the refined Professor Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady or the whimsical doctor who talks to animals in Dr. Dolittle, Harrison projected cultured elegance that made him one of Hollywood's most distinguished British imports. This polished exterior concealed a man whose cold cruelty and emotional brutality may have driven one wife to suicide and left others psychologically shattered. Harrison's first wife, actress Carol Landis, committed suicide after a heated argument with him, notes entertainment historian Thomas Henderson. While he was never legally implicated in her death, the circumstances surrounding their relationship and her final days raised disturbing questions about Harrison's treatment of women. Technically, Landis wasn't Harrison's wife, but his mistress. He was married to actress Lily Palmer at the time of his affair with Landis. This didn't stop him from allegedly treating Landis with the same dismissive cruelty that characterized his marriages. On July 4, 1948, after what witnesses described as a particularly vicious argument with Harrison, who had reportedly ended their relationship, Landis took an overdose of Seconal. Harrison discovered her body, but instead of immediately calling authorities, first called his studio's publicity department. He then left the scene before police arrived, creating the appearance of distancing himself from the situation. This callous response to Landis's suicide attempt, by the time authorities arrived she was beyond saving, reflected patterns described by Harrison's actual wives. Throughout his 6 marriages, a consistent picture emerged of a man who could be viciously cruel behind closed doors while maintaining impeccable public manners. Biographers claim Harrison was emotionally abusive and dismissive in his relationships, Henderson continues. Multiple wives described his cutting remarks, cold rejection, and ability to inflict maximum emotional damage through carefully chosen insults. He specialized in making women feel worthless while giving them just enough intermittent approval to maintain psychological control. Kay Kendall, Harrison's third wife, experienced perhaps the most disturbing manipulation. When she was diagnosed with leukemia, doctors told Harrison she had only a few years to live, but recommended not telling her to avoid causing distress that might shorten her life further. Harrison married Kendall, but maintained the deception about her condition until her death in 1959, later claiming he had done so out of compassion. However, friends reported that he used his knowledge of her terminal condition as a form of control in their relationship, sometimes making cryptic references that confused Kendall while reminding Harrison of his power over information crucial to her life. This psychological manipulation represented a particularly insidious form of emotional abuse, using her literal life expectancy as a secret he controlled. Charming in public, brutal in private. This stark contrast defined Harrison's relationships. His public persona as the quintessential English gentleman never slipped, while behind closed doors, he subjected his wives to cold disdain, verbal lacerations, and psychological warfare that left lasting damage. The studio system had no difficulty maintaining Harrison's sophisticated image because he never allowed his mask to slip in public. Unlike stars whose alcoholism or violence might create public incidents requiring studio intervention, Harrison's brand of abuse was primarily psychological and always private, making it both less visible and in some ways more devastating for its targets. The image, the refined English gentleman who spoke with perfect diction. The reality, a cold, cruel man whose cutting remarks could leave deeper scars than physical blows.
National anthem, but you needn't rise.
The volatile voice, Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's voice made women swoon across America. His smooth, intimate singing style created the impression of a tender, romantic speaking directly to each female listener. This musical persona, combined with his cool Rat Pack image, established Sinatra as the ultimate ladies' man, sophisticated, passionate, and irresistible. The women who actually shared his life, however, experienced a very different Sinatra, one whose volcanic temper and physical aggression turned romance into terror with alarming frequency. Sinatra had documented violent outbursts and multiple domestic incidents with wives Nancy Barbado and Ava Gardner, explains celebrity biographer Rebecca Santos. While his public image focused on his musical genius and suave personality, in private settings Sinatra was known for explosive anger that could quickly escalate from shouting to physical confrontation. His first wife, Nancy Barbado, endured the early manifestations of this pattern. Married in 1939 when Sinatra was still building his career, Nancy experienced his growing volatility as his fame increased. Friends reported witnessing Sinatra's verbal tirades against Nancy, though she herself never publicly discussed specific incidents of physical abuse during their marriage, which ended in 1951 after Sinatra's infidelities with multiple women, most notably Ava Gardner. It was during his tempestuous relationship with Gardner that Sinatra's violent tendencies became more widely known within Hollywood circles. Gardner, a major star in her own right, was less willing to remain silent about Sinatra's behavior than Nancy had been. Ava Gardner once said, "He hit me. It wasn't often, but it happened." Santos continues. This rare public acknowledgement of domestic violence by a star of Gardner's stature would have been career-ending for Sinatra, if not for the protective shield provided by his studio and the different social attitudes of the era regarding domestic conflicts. The violence wasn't entirely one-sided. Gardner was known to have a fiery temperament herself, and some altercations were reportedly mutual. However, the power imbalance inherent in physical confrontations between a man and woman, particularly given Sinatra's connections to organized crime figures who added an implicit level of threat to any conflict, created a fundamentally abusive dynamic regardless of who initiated specific arguments. Police were allegedly called during some incidents, notes Santos. But like many domestic disturbances involving powerful celebrities during this era, these calls rarely resulted in formal reports or charges. Officers would be encouraged to handle situations discreetly, often meaning they would simply separate the couple temporarily rather than creating any official record that might damage Sinatra's career. After his divorce from Gardner in 1957, Sinatra's pattern of volatility continued in his relationships with third wife Mia Farrow and fourth wife Barbara Marx, though with apparently decreasing physical elements as he aged. The emotional abuse, shouting, intimidation, and controlling behavior remained consistent features of his relationships, according to those close to the couples. He sang love songs, then came home and shouted her down. This contrast between Sinatra's public romantic persona and his private treatment of women represents one of Hollywood's most successful image management achievements. Even as he was crooning tender ballads that made him the voice of American romance, the women in his actual life were experiencing behavior that contradicted every romantic sentiment he expressed professionally. The studio system's protection of Sinatra extended beyond typical image management due to his connections with organized crime figures. These associations created additional layers of intimidation that prevented victims, witnesses, and law enforcement from addressing his domestic violence through normal channels, effectively placing him above accountability for his treatment of women. The image, the smooth-voiced romantic who made America fall in love. The reality, a man whose explosive temper turned private homes into war zones.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please don't make me rude, but I couldn't help noticing you back there on the terrace. I said to myself, I've seen that face somewhere before.
The swashbuckling abuser, Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn defined swashbuckling heroism for a generation of moviegoers. His daring performances in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood established him as cinema's ultimate adventurer, handsome, athletic, and irresistibly charming as he battled villains and rescued damsels in distress. Off-screen, Flynn's behavior inverted this heroic persona completely. The women in his life weren't rescued by Flynn. They needed rescue from him. Flynn was married 3 times, with a long history of violent behavior and statutory rape charges, notes film historian Margaret Collins. Behind his charismatic public image lurked a man with deeply troubling attitudes toward women, combining sexual predation with physical intimidation and controlling behavior that created a pattern of abuse throughout his relationships. Flynn's first marriage to actress Lily Damita established the template for his approach to wives. Colleagues reported witnessing Flynn's threatening behavior toward Damita, including public arguments that escalated to physical intimidation. The marriage lasted from 1935 to 1942, ending amid allegations of Flynn's multiple infidelities and increasingly erratic, alcohol-fueled behavior. His second marriage, to Nora Eddington, continued the pattern of controlling behavior and explosive anger, now complicated by Flynn's escalating substance abuse issues. Eddington later described living in fear of Flynn's unpredictable rages, which could be triggered by simple domestic disagreements or his frequent paranoid jealousy. Wives accused him of being explosive, controlling, and physically aggressive, Collins continues. While Flynn carefully maintained his heroic public image, in private settings his behavior toward women bore little resemblance to the chivalrous characters he portrayed on screen. Multiple accounts describe him using his imposing physical presence. He stood 6 feet 2 inches and was athletic despite his increasing health problems to intimidate the women in his life. By his third marriage to actress Patrice Wymore in 1950, Flynn's health was declining due to his excessive drinking and reported drug use. However, his volatile behavior continued, with Wymore reportedly experiencing similar patterns of control and intimidation that had characterized his previous marriages. Beyond the domestic abuse that defined his marriages, Flynn's broader attitude toward women revealed deeply disturbing patterns. In 1942, he was charged with statutory rape of 2 underage girls, ages 17 and 16. While ultimately acquitted, the trial revealed Flynn's predatory sexual behavior and casual disregard for appropriate boundaries with young women, aspects of his character that the studio system had previously managed to keep hidden from the public. The swashbuckler fought everyone, including his wives. This observation captures the fundamental contradiction of Flynn's public and private personas. The man who represented heroic masculinity on screen embodied its toxic counterpart in his personal relationships, using his physical advantages to control and intimidate rather than protect. Warner Brothers invested heavily in maintaining Flynn's heroic image despite mounting evidence of his problematic behavior. As one of their most bankable stars throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, Flynn received extraordinary protection from the studio's publicity department and legal team, which worked to suppress negative stories and settle potential complaints before they could become public. Flynn's story represents a particularly stark example of the gap between Hollywood's manufactured heroes and the actual men behind these idealized images. While audiences cheered his on-screen derring-do and principled courage, the women who knew him intimately experienced a reality that contradicted every heroic quality his films celebrated. The Image, cinema's greatest swashbuckling hero, saving damsels in distress. The Reality, a predatory abuser whose wives and girlfriends needed saving from him.
Darling, your generosity is charming. You are charming. But in diplomacy, an impersonal attitude is the best thing.
The Verbal Assassin, George Sanders. George Sanders built his career playing sophisticated villains and sardonic wits. His cultured British accent and talent for delivering cutting remarks with elegant precision made him the perfect cad in films ranging from All About Eve to Rebecca. Audiences loved to hate his on-screen personas, appreciating the artful cruelty he brought to these roles. For his wives, particularly actress Zia Zia Gabor, there was nothing entertaining about Sanders' cruelty. The same verbal precision that made him effective on screen became a weapon of psychological destruction in his marriages. Sanders was known for verbal cruelty and emotional abuse, explains entertainment historian Robert Thompson. While his brand of domestic abuse rarely involved physical violence, multiple wives and partners describe systematic campaigns of belittlement, humiliation, and psychological torture that left lasting emotional scars. Zaza Gabor, who was married to Sanders from 1949 to 1954, provided the most detailed public accounts of his abusive behavior. In her autobiography and interviews, Gabor described living with a man who used his intelligence and verbal dexterity not to entertain, but to demolish her self-esteem through carefully calibrated insults. Gabor claimed he belittled and humiliated her constantly, Thompson continues. According to her accounts, Sanders would criticize everything from her appearance to her intelligence, often in front of friends or industry colleagues, for maximum humiliation. He seemed to derive satisfaction from identifying her insecurities and exploiting them through comments designed to appear witty to observers while delivering maximum psychological damage. This pattern of verbal evisceration continued in Sanders' subsequent marriages to Benita Hume, 1959 to 1967, ending with her death, and Magda Gabor, Zaza's sister, in a brief 1970 marriage that lasted only 32 days before she filed for divorce, citing his mental cruelty. He never raised a hand. He didn't have to. His words were worse. This assessment captures the distinctive nature of Sanders' abuse. less visible than physical violence but potentially no less damaging in its psychological impact. Sanders weaponized his intelligence and verbal precision to maintain control in his relationships, creating an atmosphere of constant criticism that left his partners perpetually off balance and insecure. The entertainment industry of the era had little framework for recognizing or addressing this type of emotional abuse. While physical violence might occasionally generate police involvement or public incidents requiring studio intervention, the kind of systematic verbal cruelty that characterized Sanders' relationships remained largely invisible to outside observers, or worse, was sometimes misinterpreted as merely his famous wit operating in private settings. Sanders' own psychological struggles became tragically evident in his 1972 suicide at age 65. His suicide note, with its famous line, "I am leaving because I am bored," reflected the same detached cynicism that had characterized his screen persona and personal relationships. This final communication suggested a man who had maintained emotional distance not just from others, but perhaps from himself, using verbal cruelty as a mechanism for keeping authentic connection at bay. The pattern of abuse Sanders established in his relationships reveals how psychological cruelty can function as effectively as physical violence in creating controlling, damaging dynamics. His story demonstrates the limitations of mid-20th century understandings of domestic abuse, which often failed to recognize emotional terrorism as a serious form of relationship violence deserving intervention and consequence. The image, the witty, sophisticated British gentleman with the perfect cutting remark. The reality, a man who used his verbal gifts to psychologically destroy the women who loved him.
I'm sure I don't know. Why don't you try it and find out?
Thanks very much.
Not at all?
The Aging Terror, John Barrymore. John Barrymore was Hollywood royalty, part of an acting dynasty that represented theatrical excellence and cultural refinement. Known as the Great Profile for his striking good looks in his prime, Barrymore brought classical acting tradition to early cinema, earning respect for his performances in films like Grand Hotel and Dinner at 8. As his career progressed, and alcoholism took an increasing toll on both his appearance and behavior, the distinguished actor transformed into something far darker, particularly for the women unfortunate enough to be married to him. Barrymore was an alcoholic and physically abusive toward multiple partners, notes film historian Michael Barnes. While his early career established him as one of America's great actors, his later years were defined by increasingly erratic behavior, explosive outbursts, and troubling treatment of the women in his life as his alcoholism progressed from problematic to completely debilitating. Barrymore was married 4 times, but it was his 4th wife, actress Elaine Barry, who provided the most detailed accounts of his abusive behavior during the final phase of his life and career. Married to Barrymore from 1936 to 1940, Barry experienced the actor in his declining years, when his alcoholism had advanced to the point of causing significant physical and mental deterioration. Elaine Barry detailed episodes of rage, furniture smashing, and threats, Barnes continues. According to her accounts, Barrymore's drinking would trigger explosive anger that transformed their home into a danger zone. While he had always been prone to dramatic behavior, his later years saw these tendencies evolve into genuinely frightening episodes that left Barry fearing for her safety. Barry described incidents where an intoxicated Barrymore would destroy household items, breaking mirrors and overturning furniture during arguments. More disturbing were the occasions when his rage focused directly on her, with verbal tirades escalating to physical intimidation and threats that sometimes caused her to flee their home until he had sobered and calmed down. The pattern of alcohol-fueled violence wasn't limited to Barry. Previous wives had experienced similar behavior, though with less public documentation. His 3rd wife, actress Dolores Costello, married 1928 to 1934, maintained more privacy about their relationship, but reportedly left the marriage partly due to Barrymore's increasing alcoholism and the behavioral problems that accompanied it. He didn't age gracefully, he aged violently. This observation captures the trajectory of Barrymore's personal decline, the way his distinguished early career gave way to a troubling final chapter marked by addiction and abuse. Unlike stars who managed to maintain at least public dignity throughout their lives, Barrymore's deterioration became increasingly difficult for the studio system to conceal as his behavior grew more erratic and his alcoholism more visible. By the time of his death in 1942, at age 59, Barrymore had become a cautionary tale within Hollywood, a once great star whose personal demons had destroyed both his career and his relationships. The physical toll of decades of heavy drinking was evident in his appearance, while the psychological and behavioral impact manifested in his treatment of those closest to him, particularly his wives. Barrymore's story illustrates a pattern common to several Golden Age stars: the way untreated alcoholism could transform talented, successful men into abusive partners whose violence increased as their health and careers declined. The entertainment industry of the era had few mechanisms for addressing addiction or protecting spouses from its consequences, creating situations where wives like Barry had little recourse except endurance or escape. The image: the distinguished classical actor from America's greatest theatrical family. The reality: a deteriorating alcoholic whose rage turned household objects, and sometimes people, into targets.
Like an awful lot of fun, doesn't it?
Yeah. Wait a minute here. There is something here that needs explaining.
What needs explaining?
What's all this nonsense about you dancing with Van Johnson?
The Cuban Rage, Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz charmed America as Ricky Ricardo, the loving if sometimes exasperated husband to Lucille Ball's zany Lucy on I Love Lucy. Their on-screen chemistry and apparent devotion created one of television's most beloved couples, with millions of viewers inviting them into their living rooms each week to share in their comedic domestic adventures. The reality behind television's most famous marriage revealed a disturbing gap between public perception and private truth, one where Ball's comedic portrayal of a wife trying to please her husband took on darker dimensions when the cameras stopped rolling. Lucille Ball never claimed physical abuse, but friends reported violent outbursts, property damage, and screaming matches, notes television historian Rebecca Santos. The contrast between the beloved TV couple and their actual relationship represents one of Hollywood's most successful illusions, a fictional marriage that audiences accepted as reflecting reality while the truth remained carefully hidden behind studio gates. Ball and Arnaz's actual relationship was complicated by multiple factors that created a volatile dynamic. Arnaz's frequent infidelity created ongoing tension, with Ball repeatedly confronted by evidence of his affairs with other women. His heavy drinking exacerbated the situation, lowering his inhibitions and triggering explosive arguments that sometimes escalated beyond verbal confrontation. Friends described incidents where an intoxicated Arnaz would become uncontrollably angry, smashing dishes, breaking furniture, and engaging in tirades that could last for hours, Santos continues. While Ball never publicly claimed that Arnaz physically struck her, those close to the couple reported that she sometimes feared for her safety during his worst episodes, particularly when alcohol intensified his jealous accusations or rage over perceived slights. The couple's business relationship added another layer of complexity to their troubled marriage. As co-owners of Desilu Productions, they maintained professional collaboration even as their personal relationship deteriorated, creating situations where Ball couldn't simply leave the marriage without potentially damaging her career and the television empire they had built together. Combined with chronic cheating and drinking, Lucille was reportedly afraid for her safety during certain periods, explains Santos. The power dynamics within their relationship were complicated by their business partnership, with Ball sometimes feeling trapped in a marriage that had become emotionally abusive but represented significant professional and financial entanglements that would be difficult to disentangle. The public narrative around their relationship focused on cultural differences and temperamental mismatches, Arnaz's Latin temper versus Ball's driven professionalism, rather than acknowledging the more troubling aspects of his behavior. This framing minimized legitimate concerns about his conduct, while providing a convenient explanation for tensions that occasionally became visible despite the couple's efforts to maintain their public image. He broke hearts, and sometimes he broke furniture too. This observation captures the dual nature of Arnaz's mistreatment. The emotional abuse of serial infidelity combined with physically intimidating behavior that stopped short of direct assault, but nevertheless created an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. CBS and Desilu Productions had enormous financial incentive to maintain the illusion of the Arnaz-Ball marriage, regardless of its deteriorating reality. With I Love Lucy representing one of television's most valuable properties, the authenticity of its central relationship seemed crucial to its continued success. This commercial consideration created institutional pressure to conceal problems that might have damaged audience connection to the show's premise. When Ball finally divorced Arnaz in 1960 after 20 years of marriage, the public narrative emphasized career pressures and growing apart rather than the more troubling aspects of their relationship. Both partners maintained this more palatable version of events in subsequent years, protecting both their continued business relationship and the legacy of the beloved series that had made them household names. The Image, television's most beloved husband, the charming, accented foil to Lucy's antics. The reality, a jealous alcoholic philanderer whose rage turned their real home into a frightening place far removed from the comforting fictional apartment that audiences adored.
I'm praying for rain in California.
The dark tough guy, Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum epitomized cool detachment on screen. His half-lidded gaze and laconic style created an impression of unflappable confidence that made him one of Hollywood's most distinctive leading men. In films like Night of the Hunter and Cape Fear, he demonstrated remarkable range while maintaining the effortless tough guy persona that became his trademark. Away from the cameras, Mitchum's cultivated nonchalance masked a volatile temperament that could erupt into violence, particularly when fueled by the alcohol that played an increasingly central role in his life as his career progressed. Mitchum was arrested multiple times for fighting and alcohol-related incidents, notes celebrity biographer James Morrison. While his brushes with the law contributed to his rebellious public image, they also hinted at behavioral patterns that extended into his private relationships, including his marriage to Dorothy Mitchum, which lasted from 1940 until his death in 1997, despite significant turbulence. Dorothy Mitchum maintained remarkable public discretion throughout their 57-year marriage, rarely discussing the difficulties she experienced as Robert's wife. This silence reflected both the generational expectations for wives of her era and the particular challenges of being married to a star whose tough guy image was valuable commercial property for the studio system. Biographers say he had violent fights with wife Dorothy, though she stayed with him, Morrison continues. Those close to the couple reported that Mitchum's drinking would trigger arguments that sometimes escalated to physical confrontation, though the specific nature of these incidents remains largely undocumented due to Dorothy's privacy and the studio system's effective suppression of potential scandals. Mitchum's 1948 arrest for marijuana possession brought unwanted attention to his personal behavior, requiring significant studio intervention to protect his career. While this incident focused on drug use rather than domestic issues, it illustrated both Mitchum's disregard for conventional boundaries and the industry's capacity to manage potentially career-ending situations when sufficiently motivated by financial considerations. He didn't start fights until he drank. Then he didn't stop them. This pattern characterized Mitchum's relationship with conflict both publicly and privately. When sober, he often projected the same cool detachment that defined his screen persona. But alcohol transformed this characteristic reserve into volatile unpredictability, creating situations where minor disagreements could escalate to physical confrontation with little warning. Dorothy Mitchum's decision to remain in the marriage despite these challenges reflected multiple factors beyond simple endurance of abuse. As the mother of their children and a woman of her generation, she faced both practical limitations and social expectations that complicated any potential decision to leave the relationship, regardless of Robert's behavior. The entertainment industry's approach to Mitchum's behavior exemplified its typical handling of valuable male stars during this era, simultaneously exploiting the dangerous aspects of his persona for marketing purposes, while working to ensure that specific incidents of misconduct remained contained and unpublicized. This created a situation where hints of Mitchum's volatility became part of his appeal, without allowing the full reality of his behavior to threaten his marketability. Mitchum's case illustrates a particularly common dynamic in Hollywood relationships: the way certain forms of male misbehavior became integrated into stars' public images as roguish or rebellious qualities, while the actual impact of this behavior on wives and families remained carefully hidden from public view. The bad boy became a marketable commodity, even as the real consequences of that behavior were absorbed privately by women who had little recourse against powerful husbands protected by an enabling industry. The image, the ultimate cool, unflappable tough guy who never lost his composure. The reality, an alcohol-fueled volcano whose eruptions left his wife picking up the pieces for nearly 6 decades.
So that's it. Sit on a rock in the middle of Lake Michigan, pick your nose, examine your navel. Call that getting out of it?
The coldly cruel James Mason. James Mason brought refined menace to the screen, his distinctive voice and penetrating gaze creating some of cinema's most memorable villains. Even in sympathetic roles, Mason projected an intensity that suggested complexity beneath a controlled surface, a quality that made him one of Hollywood's most respected British imports throughout the 1950s and beyond. In his private life, Mason's controlled demeanor masked a different kind of intensity, a calculated cruelty toward his wife Pamela that manifested not in explosive outbursts, but in sustained psychological warfare conducted with the same precision he brought to his performances. Mason's wife Pamela wrote in her memoir about controlling demeaning behavior, notes film historian Thomas Henderson. Unlike abusers whose violence erupted in dramatic episodes, Mason specialized in a more insidious form of mistreatment. Consistent undermining, calculated humiliation, and systematic control that created a psychologically destructive environment within their marriage. Pamela Mason's accounts described a husband who rarely shouted or engaged in physical intimidation, instead deploying subtle tactics of dismissal, denigration, and domination that were in some ways more difficult to identify as abuse, yet potentially no less damaging in their cumulative impact. Friends described their marriage as warfare, Henderson continues. Those close to the couple observed a relationship defined by constant tension and power struggles rather than partnership. James maintained rigid control over household decisions, finances, and social connections, while consistently diminishing Pamela's contributions, opinions, and needs through a combination of dismissive remarks and cold withdrawal. The Masons' marriage lasted from 1941 to 1964, producing 2 children before ending in one of Hollywood's then most expensive divorces. Throughout those 23 years, James maintained public dignity while allegedly engaging in private behavior that systematically undermined his wife's confidence and autonomy. Pamela Mason's eventual public accounts of their marriage revealed a man whose mistreatment operated through calculated precision rather than explosive rage. She described James regulating her behavior through disapproval, withholding affection and financial resources when displeased, and employing his considerable verbal skills to deliver devastating critiques disguised as reasonable commentary. He wasn't a brute, just a slow burn kind of cruel. This distinction captures the distinctive nature of Mason's alleged abuse, less immediately identifiable than physical violence or explosive verbal tirades, but potentially equally harmful through its persistent, inescapable nature. Like water slowly eroding stone, Mason's approach gradually wore away his wife's psychological defenses through constant subtle pressure rather than dramatic incidents. The entertainment industry of the era had even less framework for recognizing this type of abuse than for addressing more obvious physical mistreatment. The absence of visible bruises or public incidents meant Mason's behavior remained entirely private until Pamela began speaking about it after their divorce, by which point his established reputation largely insulated him from serious professional consequences. Mason's approach to controlling his wife reflected the same attention to detail and psychological insight that made him effective on screen, a troubling application of genuine talent toward destructive ends in his personal relationship. His story illustrates how domestic abuse can manifest through sophistication rather than merely brute force, creating situations where victims may struggle to name or identify their experience even as they suffer its effects. The image, the sophisticated British actor with perfect diction and controlled intensity. The reality, a methodical, emotional torturer whose weapon wasn't his fists, but his calculating mind.
No. You're going to go to your mother's. I'm not going to have any sniffling around.
The beloved brute, Wallace Beery. Wallace Beery created a career playing lovable tough guys with hearts of gold. His gruff exterior hiding inner kindness became his signature in films like The Champ, where his performance as a down-and-out boxer caring for his son won him an Academy Award. This screen persona established Beery as one of MGM's most reliable stars throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. Behind this carefully crafted image of rough-edged decency lurked a man whose actual behavior toward women, particularly his first wife, Gloria Swanson, reportedly contained nothing of the redeeming kindness his characters typically revealed by each film's conclusion. Beery allegedly beat his first wife, actress Gloria Swanson, notes film historian Margaret Collins. While their marriage predated his greatest Hollywood success, Swanson's later accounts of their brief union revealed behavior that contradicted everything about the lovable characters that would eventually make Beery a beloved figure to movie audiences. Swanson's marriage to Beery lasted less than 2 years, 1916 to 1918, but contained incidents that she would later describe as profoundly traumatic. In her 1980 autobiography, Swanson on Swanson, she recounted experiences that went beyond typical marital discord into clear physical abuse. Swanson said in her autobiography that Beery once punched her in the stomach, causing a miscarriage. Collins continues, "This devastating allegation represented one of the most serious accusations of domestic violence from the early Hollywood era, made more significant by coming from a major star about another major figure in the industry." According to Swanson, this assault occurred after she became pregnant, suggesting Beery's deliberate intention to end the pregnancy through violence. This incident, if accurately described, would represent not just domestic abuse, but potentially criminal assault. However, like many allegations from this period of Hollywood history, it remained primarily Swanson's word against Beery's, with no contemporary documentation or legal proceedings to provide additional verification. What gives Swanson's account additional credibility is that she waited over 60 years to make these allegations public, well after Beery's death in 1949 had removed any possibility of legal repercussions or professional advantage from such claims. Her willingness to share these experiences in her final years suggests a desire to establish historical truth rather than pursue personal gain. The contrast between Beery's alleged private behavior and his carefully constructed screen persona represents one of Hollywood's most successful image management achievements, creating a beloved figure associated with gruff kindness from a man whose actual treatment of at least one woman in his life reportedly demonstrated genuine cruelty. He was beloved on screen and monstrous off it. This observation captures the extraordinary disconnect between Beery's public image and the behavior described by Swanson. The man who made audiences laugh and cry with his portrayal of flawed but fundamentally decent characters allegedly engaged in conduct that contradicted these qualities entirely in his private life. MGM had significant financial investment in maintaining Beery's likable image, particularly after his Academy Award success established him as one of the studio's valuable properties. Any hint of the behavior Swanson would later describe would have devastated his carefully constructed persona and potentially ended his career, creating powerful institutional motivation to suppress any contemporary accounts or rumors about his treatment of women. Beery's case illustrates the particular effectiveness of the studio system in separating public persona from private reality during Hollywood's golden age. Without today's social media and interconnected press, stars' images could be manufactured and maintained with remarkable completeness, allowing figures like Beery to project values and qualities on screen that bore little resemblance to their actual character and conduct. The image, the gruff exterior, hiding a heart of gold in beloved family films. The reality, a man who allegedly punched his pregnant wife in the stomach, causing a miscarriage.